Is Gerard Minack, Chief Economist with Morgan Stanley. Gerard Minack, thanks for coming on Lateline.
Thanks, Ellie.
Well, that optimism that the markets are clearly responding to, that Europe will come up with a plan, do you believe it's well-founded?
There are many, many hurdles that we have to get over before you can say the Europe crisis is behind us. What markets are now speculating about is another upgrade to the bailout package, the so-called EFSF. Ironically, we haven't seen the last expansion of the EFSF approved yet. In Germany, that's coming up before a vote of their parliament in 2 days' time. So markets seem to be, in my view, getting ahead of themselves, and plus there's additional hurdles coming next year because I think it's extremely likely that we see Europe back in recession. So all the problems in Europe now will get worse next year. In a recession, we'll see bank bad debt start to rise, we'll see budget deficits go up, and we may even get to the stage where nominal GDP, the nominal size of the economy, starts to shrink, which all of a sudden starts to really blow out the debt to GDP ratios. So if Europe looks in a mess now, it could be in an even bigger mess next year, and I'm not sure that policymakers in Europe are yet able to get over that hurdle.
Well, indeed. I mean, from what you're saying, that would seem to imply that there really isn't a rescue package that's going to be able to achieve any concrete aims. I mean, as you just referred to, the market seems to be focusing on this increase to the bailout facility, but even that's now been denied by Spain's finance minister. I mean, is there any real sense of where European leaders are going?
No, and that's been one of the problems. European leaders have been going in all different directions, and that reflects the fact that as we've seen them struggle with more and more unconventional policy measures, they've been running into higher and higher hurdles, and those hurdles can be legal, they can be institutional, or they can be political. And what we're seeing mount in Germany is opposition already to this extension of the EFSF, the bailout package that's going to be passed or come up for Parliament later this week, let alone strengthening opposition to a further increase in the fund. And all markets are running on at the moment is press reports. We haven't had a concrete announcement from anybody senior. So to me, this strength in markets that we're seeing says as much about how far they'd fallen over the prior month as about the tangible prospect of getting a really big deal coming out of European policymakers.
And if you see recession in Europe next year, do you also see that any rescue is going to involve some sort of default by Greece? Do you see the Eurozone as being able to ring-fence those bigger economies of Italy and Spain?
Well, that's the problem. I mean, we all know Greece is insolvent, and of course the bailout package was initially set up to deal with effectively the insolvency of Greece, Ireland and Portugal. But what's really scared markets over the last month is we have moved on to much larger economies, Spain and Italy. And there's two things to note about Spain and Italy. The first is in terms of who's contributed to the bailout fund, those two economies are contributing around a third of the resource. So all of a sudden you've got a question mark about who's chipping in to bail out the periphery because they are now coming under stress themselves. The second point is the cliche about Italy is absolutely right. It's not too big to fail, but it's too big to bail out. And that's why we had the US Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner warn over the weekend that Europe really is on the brink of a catastrophe. In other words, we're talking about something much more worse than just a vanilla recession, and arguably something worse even than what we saw in 2008. Because if we do see Italy come under pressure, it could be the trigger for disorderly country level and then banking defaults. It really is a worst-case endgame scenario for Europe, but that's what markets have been fearing over the last month.
You're a well-known bear. What's your best bet?
I think it's very difficult now for Europe to get out of this without breaching a lot of the conventions that have held it together. Ultimately, in my view, over the next year, we either have to go one of two ways. One, massive ECB money printing, so-called monetisation. In other words, just standing in the market and buying the bonds, which effectively prints money, which of course has enormous resistance, particularly in Germany, who have been scarred obviously by their examples of hyperinflation last century. That may sound a difficult option, but the other one, which I now think is is much more than just a trivial risk, is that disorderly, dysfunctional default option. And I'd never really considered it that big a risk a year ago, but what has changed the game over the last 2 months is the deal they put together to bail out Greece 2 months ago, where they forced on the private bondholders a restructured private debt arrangement. Technically, we saw the first default by a developed economy on their sovereign debt 2 months ago. And what we've seen since then is everybody saying if it could happen to Greece, it could happen to Spain, it could happen to Italy. So we've seen this massive flow of funds out of not just the periphery, but out of anybody but Germany and France. And it's really up to the ECB to plug that flow, and to do that, I think they just need to print almost unlimited amounts of money.
You mentioned Timothy Geithner before. I mean, what about the ramifications for the US? So is there an argument that, in fact, the US is already back in recession?
I don't think the US is back in recession, but I think it's more likely than not it will go back into recession. And one of the great ironies of what we've been seeing over the last year as policymakers have responded to this looming threat of sovereign stress is they've been increasing their fiscal tightening, so tightening their budgetary policy. Now, in a cycle management sense, that's absolutely the last thing we need to see. And what the US is facing is a substantial tightening of fiscal policy next year as the Obama stimulus from last year expires. On our numbers, they'll be tightening fiscal policy by around 1.25% to 1.5% of GDP. And that's quite severe fiscal tightening that's going to hit an economy that is already growing at just 1.5% over the 4 quarters to June. Now, historically, the US has never slowed to 1.5% growth without subsequently going into recession in the next year. So there's already strong circumstantial evidence that the US is on the brink of a recession, and it's about to be clobbered in the new year with substantial fiscal tightening. And for me, US probably will head into recession. I think it's a 3 out of 4 chance. And what increases that risk is that Europe goes into recession, bearing in mind that if you look at Europe, the US and the UK, they are each other's major trading partners. So if one goes into recession, it increases the risk of another one going into recession. And
indeed, of course, the major trading partner for China is the Eurozone. So what does all that mean for Australia and China?
Well, this is certainly a headwind for China. The good news for China specifically and Asia generally is that they have been tightening policy over the last year, and that means, unlike in the developed world, where in the developed world we've got no conventional policy bullets left, the Chinese can turn on a dime and in a sense repeat the same policy response that we saw so successfully in 2008. So we can see them reverse course on monetary policy and lower their interest rates. We can see them provide fiscal stimulus again. So I think this is, for China, a threat that they're able to respond to. And although there are investors who worry about a so-called China hard landing, I don't think that's in prospect yet. I do think China will slow a little next year as Europe goes into recession, but yet again I think they'll be able to successfully avoid a recession in China.
Well, that's good news for Australia. Gerard Minak, many thanks for joining us from London tonight.
You're welcome.